Alright, let's get a disclaimer out of the way. This video is not meant to convince people to not like any character. It's not meant to convince people not to ship any two characters together, and it's not even meant to change anybody's opinions. I only want to elucidate some facts, as it seems that there's been too much confusion. See, across the internet there's been a persistent push of a specific narrative, one that advocates that the proper reading of the Star Wars sequel trilogy is to believe that, ultimately, Kylo Ren was blameless, manipulated into temporary lapses in judgment, but still resistant against evil. More specifically, though, he may have done some bad acts, but he never committed genocide. And this, patently, is untrue and, in my opinion, is dangerous. So, the idea that Ben Solo did nothing wrong, a phrase that, as far as I can tell, was adapted from a Holocaust-denying meme, but maybe it's just a coincidence, is centered around a few central tenets. 1. Ben Solo was abused and manipulated since birth, and had literal voices in his head, and he can't be held responsible for his actions. 2. The genocide at Luke's temple was retconned to be a lightning storm, and the Hosnian cataclysm was the fault of Hux and Snoke. Kylo didn't want it to happen. 3. Twanul housed enemy combatants, and their deaths were justified. 4. Luke blew up the first Death Star, Lando blew up the second Death Star, and Poe blew up the third Death Star. If we're going to hold Ben accountable, Luke and Lando and Poe are even worse. And 5. The deaths of nameless extras are essentially meaningless in the span of morality. If Kylo doesn't kill at least some people, then how is he redeemed? It's fictional. It doesn't matter. Alright, let's go through each one of these points and discuss how none of them actually absolve Ben of any wrongdoing. 1. Ben Solo was abused and manipulated since birth and had literal voices in his head and can't be held responsible for his actions. It is true that Kylo heard voices in his head, though it's not clear how long this was the case, and no, it's never said that he was controlled since conception. We are told he heard voices, and at some point between the ages of 13 and 20, he was groomed by Snoke to join the dark side. And, following his fall at the age of 23, he was abused by Snoke physically, verbally, and emotionally. Without a doubt, his life was not easy. But neither was mine, or a ton of other people's. I was abused physically, verbally, emotionally, and otherwise, and I never decided to join a neo-fascist movement. And yes, in real life, sometimes abused people are groomed into joining white supremacist groups, and that is something we should work to prevent. But when these abuse victims turn domestic terrorists, we don't say it's not their fault. We say there are others that need to be held accountable for inspiring or inciting them, but their actions are their own. And as for voices in his head, I've got too many friends with schizoaffective disorder to buy the ableist canard that hearing voices equals becoming a murderer. And if you really need representation of abuse survivors in Star Wars, which I recognize is important, you can do way better. Finn was abducted as a child, fed voices as he slept, denied a human name, kept as a slave for nearly 20 years, and he still managed to turn his back on his grooming, overcome his oppressors, and become a force for good in the universe before he committed any genocides. 2. The genocide at Luke's temple was retconned to be a lightning storm, and the Hosnian cataclysm was the fault of Hux and Snoke. Kylo didn't want it to happen. And yes, despite The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, both of their visual dictionaries, The Rise of Skywalker's visual dictionary, The Secrets of the Jedi, Princess Leia, Royal Rebel, Galactic Atlas, and Kylo Ren himself saying that it was Kylo that destroyed the temple and killed the Jedi, Charles Soule, in The Rise of Kylo Ren, did say that it was actually a freak meteorological event. And since canon works like this, I guess, this comic overrides all 3 movies and the story group. Guess I was wrong when I said, obviously Star Wars movies have always been more canon than anything released on print. So, genocide number 1, he is absolved from. I love democracy. As for the Hosnian cataclysm, it was indeed Snoke and Hux that gave the orders to fire Starkiller Base. But we are not animals. We have ways of measuring things like genocide and culpability. Using the word genocide would be irresponsible if what we were discussing wasn't actually genocide. So, let's review. The most often accepted and cited definition of genocide comes from the UN's Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which I've referenced on this channel before. Genocide is defined by, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, end quote. And then there are 5 acts listed as given the intent being genocidal, namely murder, which is obvious, inflicting serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting destructive conditions of life, preventing births of a people group, and the forcible transfer of children. In this case, yes, both the original story of the fall of Luke's Jedi and the Hosnian Cataclysm would count as genocide, being an intentional destruction of a religious and a national group, respectively. But hey, it wasn't Kylo that pulled the trigger. He was just standing there, watching. Except Article 3 of the Convention clarifies who can be held accountable for the crimes of genocide. Again, there are 5 groups: those that commit genocide, those that conspire to commit genocide, those that directly incite genocide, those that attempt genocide, and those that are complicit in genocide. See, just because a Nazi didn't personally order a genocide doesn't mean they are innocent. And before anyone says that we can't compare Kylo Ren to a Nazi, let me reiterate that the Jewish man that created him has explicitly stated that Ren is based off from Nazis. There is no mistaking this imagery, and there's also no mistaking this guilt. It's not enough to not play an active, instigating role in committing genocide. To stand idly by, to not oppose while in a willing position within the organization committing genocide, is, by the definition of the man that coined the term, genocide. Undoubtedly. And on top of this, Kylo is an accomplice. He defends the Starkiller base from attackers, and he kills the man that is trying to destroy it. Yes, Kylo may not have pulled the proverbial trigger on the metaphorical gun, but he tried his best to keep the Starkiller base safe, meaning he was going along with the genocide. 3. Tuanul housed enemy combatants, and their deaths were justified. The Hosnian Cataclysm isn't even the only genocide of which Ben was a part. In Tuanul, a sacred village on Jakku, Ren ordered that all of the villagers of a religious minority, being from the Church of the Force, were to be executed. No commandment from Snoke. Hux wasn't there. The villagers were unarmed, outmanned, and had already surrendered, after the First Order had invaded them. The battle was an invasion, but I will at least admit it was a battle. But what happened after the battle ended was genocide. People defend this by saying Tuanul gave refuge to Poe Dameron, and thus Kylo Ren was justified in ordering his slaughter. That's not how morality works. Even if we pretend that wanting a map to find your uncle is justification for combat, rounding up civilians, including children, corralling them together and executing them by firing squads solely because one person that lived in the village was having a conversation with an enemy soldier is not justified. And before I move on to point 4, there are even more genocides Kylo has committed. In Star Wars Resistance, a show made for children, Kylo Ren massacres an entire village on Tehar to intimidate the rest of the planet, with no reason or justification beyond terrorism. 2 young children escaped, and he tried to hunt them down to finish the job. Later, after Kylo Ren became the supreme leader of the First Order, he adopted a zero-tolerance policy on collaboration with the Resistance, meaning if your monarch helped Resistance members, like the Queen of Eos did, an entire section of your world would have to pay the price. And before you try to excuse this as not being Ren behind the trigger, he was directly reported to, and he punished his subordinates for not being complete enough in their assault. Finally, the movie wants us to think that Kylo is redeemable, and it opens with a Kylo-ordered and led genocide. The Alazmec of Winzit were an ethnic and religious minority on Mustafar, dedicated to planting trees and defending their holy artifacts. Since Kylo invaded their home to get one of those artifacts, he led the charge to kill every single Alazmec. 4. Luke blew up the first Death Star, Lando blew up the second Death Star, and Poe blew up the third Death Star. If we're going to hold Ben accountable, Luke, Lando, and Poe are even worse. So, is it genocide to destroy any of these 3 weapon stations? They both housed a large number of individuals, undoubtedly, and while we see evacuation efforts well underway in all 3 movies, surely several individuals did not escape and were left on board at the time of the explosion. But remember, we have definitions for genocide. The Empire and the First Order are not national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. These can't be classified as genocide due to them not being a target of an involuntarily chosen, non-religiously joined people group. Furthermore, genocide can never be an act of self-defense. It's the attack on people due to something intrinsic about them, not their actions, despite what white supremacists would have you believe. The destructions of the 2 Death Stars and the Starkiller base were measures to prevent further firing of the planet-destroying weapons. Let's suppose that less than 10% of the soldiers that signed up for the Empire that were on the Death Star were able to escape. meaning that a little less than 1 million fascists died in its explosion. That is less than half of 1/10 of 1/100% of the people that died on Alderaan alone. The numbers are even higher for the Hosnian Cataclysm. And even though slaves were on Starkiller Base, their evacuation is given even more time. In real life, the argument of self-defense in war can lead to some muddying of moral lines and justifications of foreign invasions. However, when you are besieged, it is literally do or die, and in the case of the rebels, the Ewoks, and the Resistance, it was either destroy the battle station or condemn billions to death through inaction. There is no equivalency. Finally, the reason why I wanted to make this video. 5. The deaths of nameless extras are essentially meaningless in the span of morality. If Kylo doesn't kill at least some people, then how is he redeemed? It doesn't matter, it's just fiction. In media, we're trained to be emotionally invested in characters that we follow. This mirrors real life. One peaceful death of a close friend or a family member may be more impactful than hearing of the deaths of 1 million people from a different country. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. We evolved to be able to handle only so much tragedy. We can process the deaths of those close to us, but if we felt that same sorrow for people we don't know anything about, we would be overcome by grief. After all, it wasn't until very recently in human history that we even had the ability to hear about the deaths of people outside of our communities within hours of them happening. But, and here's why I really find this topic important, there's a difference between not fully experiencing the sorrow that would come with the deaths of thousands we knew personally, and not caring about the deaths of thousands we didn't know. We physically cannot mourn the death of each individual person killed in genocide the way that we could a family member. But we can recognize their humanity, their abuse, and their grieving family and friends and descendants. We can strive to prevent similar acts from occurring again, and we can remember and honor them. So, personally, I believe that when genocide in fiction is portrayed as forgivable or unimportant or inconsequential, we run the risk of impacting how we deal with real-world injustices. We know that positive representation can lead to improved mental health for marginalized people, but negative representation works in the opposite way. By saying things like genocide just happens in war and it's okay because they deserved it, we warp our own perspectives. Repeat a lesson enough times in media, and it can become ingrained in society. And to some extent, it already has. The genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas has been warped in general white public perception to be either an accident or acceptable. And if you so much as refer to the abduction and murder of ethnic groups from West Africa during the transatlantic slave trade as a genocide, you're told that you're misusing the term. This was the goal of the American government and its history writers, certainly, but this was assisted by the pervasive lying images of brutal natives or happy slaves, images that were fed to children. Fiction does impact reality. This doesn't mean that if you like Ben Solo, or Darth Vader, or Palpatine, or Krennic, for that matter, you're a genocide apologist, of course. But if you tell your child to view a massacre-causing man as a hero to the point that they bawl at their death, if you encourage them to identify with a genocidal fascist, if you make them see peace and coexistence as secondary to the lives and happiness of mass murderers, you prioritize the sad feelings of the fictional one over the very lives of the fictional many. That can often translate to reality, especially for children. I'm not saying that people need to break down when they hear about genocide. That's something that I personally struggled with growing up. But it is good to care. It's good to feel sorrow and be impacted by the deaths of strangers, not to the point of despair and despondency, but to the point of reparation and prevention. And when fiction tells us that genocide is inevitable, forgivable, or justifiable, it does a disservice to victims and survivors and signals to consumers to care less about the suffering of the unnamed masses. The Star Wars saga has always had a trouble treating genocide seriously. In my opinion, none of the movies actually give it the weight that it deserves. But, thankfully, a lot of people realize that the redemption of Darth Vader was not one that was deserved, and that characters like Krennic and Tarkin are truly irredeemable. In the case of Kylo Ren, however, I've seen people say that he has actually done nothing wrong, which is why I felt the need to make this video. I use screenshots of fans of Kylo Ren saying some erroneous or insensitive things. I did this not to mock or belittle any individuals, but to prove that my arguments are not sent to an imagined entity. I limited myself to only find what I could using a few searches on one website that I don't have an account on, and allotted myself no more than 1 hour of time, showing that you don't need to go too far to find several dozen examples of this flippancy. That said, I left the names out intentionally. Don't harass people. However, if you encounter someone denying or minimizing genocide in fiction, feel free to share this video with them. Angrily calling people idiots when they have poor phrasing won't get us anywhere, but hopefully this video might at least explain why, to some of us, Kylo Ren's redemption feels so hollow. Before I close, I'd like to give a fantastic thank you to my friends Mando and Avery for helping me finish up the ending part of this script. This is a very sensitive topic, and I was very glad to have my friends assist me in making sure that my writing was accurate and compassionate. I'd also like to plug that Avery has a new YouTube channel called Fandom Nymphs, which I will link below in the description. Thank you for listening.